Conflicts and wars arising 5,000 years ago. A conflict and a possible war, in the Neolithic, roughly 5,000 years ago in Spain, are provingly out of Americans arriving from the Americas, seemingly with the intention to turn over certain locations in Spain, but in fact with the intention to turn over the whole of Western Europe and Western Eurasia, which we know to be true, simply because they were very successful in it. And ultimately their haplogroups would dominate the whole world. This global dominance of their haplogroups is still the case today. Further, we know this to be true, since it is proven by ancient DNA. We know it were out of Americans because their DNA and their Y-DNA haplogroup, both proof that the invaders' root or cradles were of the Y-DNA haplogroup R1, and even today, this rare Y-DNA haplogroup R1 DNA introgression is still the case in the DNA of certain Native Americans, while this nowhere else in the world is the case. This more specifically was and still is so near the coasts and rivers in the Americas that were involved in the expedition and expansion that would follow and that would become such a success, that the descendants of this rare American Y-DNA haplogroup R1 DNA today represent the dominant haplogroup in the world. Further, we claim that the Clovis stone tools, that were dominantly found in the same location, indicate predating preparations, that had served quite similar, or else preparative or population and cradle building purposes. This in function of their expansions, or this would later serve their expansions, as well as the turnover events. All of these events would have occurred during the Neolithic period, more specifically between 8,000 and 4,500 years ago, when certain new, or rather, external groups began to emerge and mix in Western Eurasia, among other places in the world. Part of this is proven by the ancient DNA research of geneticist David Reich and others. David Reich, 2021. The consensus view. For completeness and reference, we present the consensus view of the Neolithic period. For consensus, the Neolithic period occurred thousands of years ago, beginning around 10,000 BCE, this certainly so in the Fertile Crescent, and extending to around 2000 BCE in some areas. Also known as the New Stone Age, this Neolithic era was characterized by the Neolithic Revolution, a transformative shift from nomadic hunting and gathering to settled agricultural lifestyles, marked by farming, animal domestication, and the development of early settlements and civilization. Origin for existence view. We view this Neolithic era not as a start of, but simply as an expansion of elements that consensus views as new, but already were reality in the Americas, this so since long before, and in fact had also been reality in the Western Mediterranean and in certain southern parts of Western Europe, this already so during the Aurignacian culture period. This 47,000 to 41,000 years ago, but soon after, temporarily became less important or changed, and was, or became, more difficult to detect, probably because global climate kept on deteriorating, becoming colder and more arid and dusty across the globe, like is proven to be the case during the so-called Younger Dryas, which in fact was a returning phenomenon that in fact was typical for the later part of each of the series of glacial or ice ages. The conflicts or wars we focus on, and that also are presented and claimed in a video wherein we react to a video with a partly similar claim but from another independent author, refer to parts of Spain, specifically to wars south of the Pyrenees, as well as around the Ebro River, and also rock paintings in the Spanish Levantine in the east of Spain. Levantine simply means east. The Spanish Levantine is not directly related to the Levant in the Eastern Mediterranean, also known as the Middle East. Ancient DNA proves that Americans arrived in Spain 5,000 years ago. Ancient DNA, especially together with all ancestral markers, prove us all along that out of Americans roughly 5,000 years ago were arriving through the North Atlantic gyre and currents. That they had been arriving through the Atlantic Ocean gyres and currents, something that can and in our opinion needs to be deduced, but also is extensively proven by contemporary and historical archaeological evidence on the American side, as well as on the Western European, Western Eurasian, and Western Mediterranean side, just like most of the more Western Mediterranean and Western Eurasian Neanderthals before them. Intermezzo. Similarly, other out of Americans, this roughly in the same period, had been arriving around coast and rivers exposed to the Pacific Ocean, on this occasion through the Austronesian expansion, which includes the Pacific Ocean gyres and currents, and this can and needs to be deduced. but once more is extensively proven by contemporary and historical archaeological evidence on the American as well as the Asian, Middle Eastern, and even African side. End of intermezzo. Americans and Haplogroup, R1BM269. In the case of Western Europe and Western Eurasia, these out of Americans roughly 5,000 years ago already were carrying Y-DNA haplogroup R1BM269, which will end up turning over Western Eurasia, this starting out amongst others with their Atlantic facades, and exactly their Y-DNA haplogroup R1BM269 will later dominate all modern Western Europeans and modern Western Eurasians. The groups R1BM269, R1b and R1a, all three are R1 descendants of the American root R1. And together these three groups today represent a whopping 60% of all modern Western Europeans and Western Eurasians, probably this at least so from roughly 4,500 years ago on. Ancestors of the today Basques. The ancestors of the today Basques, which provingly were experienced transatlantic seafarers and whale hunters, as well as some few other isolated groups, exceptionally will not be turned over, or at least part of these ancestors can withdraw and persist, this probably at a high cost, this more or less in Basque country. And we claim that this is the reason they also retain their typical so-called native European DNA, while it in fact also were much earlier out of Americans, at least partly linked to, or descending from the Aurignacian culture. The Aurignacian culture preceded the Basques. The Aurignacian culture already was carrying Y-DNA-C and also R1b, but in their case it was an early or ancient R1b still without the in Western Eurasia arriving M269 mutation, which provingly was arriving in Western Eurasia around 4,500 years ago. The Aurignacian culture already had been culturally present in parts of Europe, this 47,000 to 41,000 years ago, already covering the strategical region in Spain in focus of this video, and as said the Basques retained the so-called hunter-gatherer DNA, and also remained rhesus negative, which we claim at least partially to have been related to this much earlier Ice Age Aurignacian culture. American white people preceded the Aurignacians and the Basques. Prehistoric and pre-Holocene South American white people preceded the Aurignacian culture and the Basques. The evidence of this is presented in other videos. Chachapoya Easter Island Moai-like. We claim that the Chachapoya are Easter Island Moai-like statues, also of bearded men and probably of elites, ancestors, and/or progenitors, with some of the oldest mummies or at least very ancient mummies literally sitting inside of the statues, quite similar as in certain burials of Amazon Amerindians across the Amazon forest. Across all continents and around the world. Similar statues are found across all continents and the world on the by-us proposed Pacific and Atlantic expansion routes. They can look bearded or with quite to bearded men, similar bird-like faces with bird beak aspects that occasionally are or seem to be masks, and occasionally also represent women. The most common feature amongst them are their arms and hands, often with long fingers, resting on their bellies or pointing to their navel or genitals. A notorious, but much less frequent, but nevertheless a global feature, are the typical bags carried by some of these figures.